Welcome to Arcade Attack. A retro gaming podcast for up to 4 players.
Hi guys, Adrian here from Arcade Attack, and on today's show I talk to a real Atari legend, Bill Rehbock. Now he has been involved in some of Jaguar's best and most respected games, including Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, Super Burnout, Atari Karts, and so much more. He's also been involved at Sony, working for the VM Labs and Nuon console, and he just goes into such good detail and depth about his past career, the amazing people he's worked with. Trust me guys, you're going to enjoy this interview very much. So sit back and enjoy a talk with a real Atari legend. Okay, so on today's Arcade Attack podcast, we have Bill Rehbock. Now, he is a proper Atari legend. He's a proper, he goes way back with the games he's worked on. He's worked on some real classics, so it's a real honour. So thank you, Bill, for joining us today.
Oh, very good to be here.
Really appreciate it. I'll go straight into the first question then. Would you be happy to share your earliest and your fondest memories of playing games when growing up? What was your first sort of games that you got involved in or really enjoyed playing when you were younger?
Oh, sure. Well, there's probably 2 or 3 specific moments that were really critical and kind of defined what I was going to wind up doing eventually, even though I didn't realize it at the time. The first was in the 1970s, my eventually wife, but then girlfriend had her brother had received a Commodore VIC-20 for Christmas holiday, and we were in his bedroom at about 3 o'clock in the morning playing a text adventure that was on a cartridge, and I had figured out, and we had gotten stuck. We had been playing for many hours, and we had gotten stuck, and I had, looking through the little manual that came with it, figured out how to use a peek instruction to be able to look into the cartridge space to find what strings this darn game wanted. But shortly after that, her father came in and was like, "What the heck are you still doing here?" So that's kind of like moment number 1. Moment number 2 was the first time that my girlfriend, same person, and this is what led me to know that she was like the right girl. She was over at my house, and my mother was in the kitchen, and we're sitting down in the living room at our family's 25-inch Magnavox TV that had our Atari 2600 plugged into it. And my sister, who's 10 years older than me, my sister and I at the time had been competing for high score on Space Invaders 2600.
Yeah.
So we had a sheet of loose leaf paper taped to the side of the TV with tally marks for the numbers of times we turned over the score and then the final score.
Wow.
And And we sit, my girlfriend and I sit down, and I'm the gentleman, and I let her go first. and she has, has her turn and it's over, and then I start, and I just got in the groove, and I couldn't stop because you can't stop, right?
Yeah.
so my poor girlfriend, wife to be, many years later, wound up sitting in the kitchen for like over 5 hours chatting with my mother as I played Space Invaders. So that made her a keeper because she actually put up with that. And then the next big moment was actually at the Consumer Electronics Show, Summer CES at McCormick Place, and a friend of mine from high school, his neighbor ran security, one of the security services at McCormick Place, and he invited me to get, kind of get hired as kind of a day job, running security cages and putting stuff in the cages at night in different companies' booths.
Yep.
And then, locking it up and securing the cage. And we fortunately, just by dumb luck, got assigned to the Atari booth. And this was, I think, when Atari launched Space Invaders.
Right.
And we were kind of hanging around the booth, and I'm playing Space Invaders, and the one guy from Atari, whose name I can't remember, and I always kind of think that it probably was John Scrutch, but right. I really have no idea. He had asked, hey, wow, it looks like you're getting pretty. Oh no, the first thing that had happened was they had said, hey, if you want to keep an eye on the booth overnight,
wow,
you guys could play the games. We'll leave this area of the booth, powered up. So they let us play these games during the night. And I got really, really good at Space Invaders. So in the morning, they said, well, if you want to go get cleaned up and come back, it'd be great if you want to just play it during the show because you're showing off the game, right? So it kind of became a demo person
nice.
For Atari back then. Again, not having any idea, of what my future with Atari would be.
It's like work experience.
Yeah, exactly. And I was an Atari fan, but couldn't afford one at the time. But certainly that kind of cemented it. That wow, this is a really cool company, right?
Yeah.
So, but to this day, frankly, Star Raiders kind of continues to be one of my favorite games because, especially playing it on hard settings, it has far more strategy in it than it looks like at first blush.
I mean, I think we'll talk about Space Invaders XL later, but it's all kind of a bit full circle, isn't it, Bill, in a sense? Is that fair enough?
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. Well, like I said, it sounds like you got the perfect work experience before you actually started properly at Atari. So I love those nice little stories there. Thank you so much for sharing them.
All right.
How did you properly then get into the video game industry? What was your first entrance into the amazing games industry?
Well, I had been a value-added reseller for Atari in Chicago, and I had my sort of history in business was that during college, I was originally a manager of a location of a pretty significant auto parts store chain.
Yep.
Working my way through college. And then a friend of mine was in mergers and acquisitions at Amoco Oil, and he was a couple of years older than me. And his brother-in-law was actually the best man at my wedding.
Okay.
And he had gotten kind of fed up with the big corporate world at Standard Oil, and he bought but he had been, amply paid, and he bought a Harley Davidson dealer in Aurora, Illinois. Did pretty well with that pretty quickly, and then sold that to buy what was one of the largest, eventually BMW, Honda, Kawasaki, Suzuki dealers, motorcycle dealers in Chicago.
Nice.
And he convinced me that hey, come join me, do this thing. And it was a very interesting kind of, both sports store, half of it was a sports store, half of it was a motorcycle store. And, but I wound up managing, kind of, it wasn't even called probably IT at the time, but I managed the computer systems there.
Yeah.
Also wound up writing a pretty extensive, very extensive, parts and service, insurance estimate system for the service department, and the point of sale system for the parts department. But through that, I wound up answering a lot of calls to a lot of the other local dealers and kind of became friends with the parts and service managers at those places. And really kind of very quickly grew my own business of PC consulting, and left that company to start my own company. Yeah. But I was still an Atari fan right through all this. And even though this was the beginnings of PC networking with, the original NetBIOS, and one of the networking companies that I worked with was a company based here right here in Silicon Valley called Artisoft. And I was doing networking when like nobody was really doing networking, early days of Token Ring and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But both, Apple and, Apple was out there selling, the Macintosh as a desktop publishing system, right? But it was crazy expensive, but everybody wanted to do it. And also the largest app on PC wound up around that time being Ventura Publisher, which was also, the price of Ventura Publisher, if I recall correctly, was like $1,200 or $1,500, right?
That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy. And, the big deal at the time was that you could put together an Atari desktop publishing system for $1,000-ish, right? And because of Atari's floppy format being PC compatible, even though Atari didn't have networking, I started, for any of my clients that wanted to do desktop publishing for, flyers and that kind of stuff, I would sell them an Atari system along with a bunch of PCs. Oh, nice. And then, sell them WordPerfect for the PC. They were able to take the WordPerfect documents easily and import them into, either WordPerfect directly on the Atari and make it fancy. And I sold like crazy amount of SLM 804 Atari laser printers, right? Yeah. And at the time, I started also working directly with Atari because I was signed up as a developer. So Gail Johnson and Charles Cherry and all those guys that were at Atari at the time, I got to know, and Jay Crosby, and then the within the development community with Atari. I had gotten to know Rick Flashman at Gribdiff Software, the folks up at MyGraph that did a bunch of cool Atari Atari applications. Kevin and Liz Mitchell were their names. Yeah. And whenever Atari would be in Chicago for a trade show like the Corporate Electronic Publishing Show and things like that, I would wind up loaning them hardware and support, and doing support and things like that for them, and got to be reasonably well known in the Atari development community. Yeah. When Charles Cherry decided to leave Atari to go to the beginnings of Autodesk, and it was, and what's his face, Tom Hudson, who had done Degas, right? And CAD 3D on Atari, was also one of the first contract employees or first employees at Autodesk. And I wound up getting a call one afternoon from Antonio Salerno saying, hey, Charles, as you probably know, Charles Cherry left. We've been doing a search for somebody to replace him. And gosh, your name kept coming up. Would you be interested in moving to Sunnyvale?
Yeah.
And I said, wow, that's a big change, for me, and my wife was a school teacher. I had my business in Chicago and everything.
Yeah.
So, but he said, tell you what, why don't you at least meet with this new guy that is currently the president of Atari, Eli Kanan, and let's have at least have the conversation. So I wound up meeting Ellie at the Toronto Atari Festival, up at his hotel room in Toronto, and he did kind of say that he hopefully was kind of considering moving the company to Boston, and I think it's kind of well known in all the rumors of Atari maybe moving from the West Coast to the East Coast, were a possibility at the time. And but ultimately he convinced me to come on out to the West Coast and visit Atari, which just as a fan I was pretty excited about, frankly, right?
Yeah.
And so we agreed to do that, and then my next trip was to fly from Chicago to the Glendale Atari Fest. I did a tour of the show floor with Ellie, met Bob Brody, met Art Morgan, and a bunch of the other folks, and the energy level was insane.
Nice.
And just all of these Atari fans, and there had never been a big Atari show per se in Chicago proper. So really kind of seeing the amount of energy and meeting all of these amazing developers that were so dedicated to the platform, more than anything else is what had me sold.
Yeah.
So then after the show was over, then flew to Sunnyvale. And bless his heart, because I still stay in touch with him. Art Morgan was kind of my guide to navigating the halls of Atari, and make what's been too long of a story shorter. Ultimately, in February of so this was September of 1991.
Yeah.
February of 1990. Ultimately, in February of 1991, my wife and I pulled up stakes and took my Volkswagen Jetta GLI and drove to California. So that was kind of the whole transition. When I first started at Atari, Atari was very still into the Atari ST.
Yeah.
The TT was like the big thing at the time, and and Jaguar wasn't really even on the radar yet. So what wound up happening though was Jack Trammell, who could figure stuff out faster than, still to this day, almost anybody that I know.
Yeah.
In terms of reading the market and everything else. He had eventually said, hey, these Taiwanese PC clones are really going to kill everyone. It's going to kill Commodore. It's going to kill us. It's going to kill Apple, which all ultimately really kind of came true.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. Yeah.
And he said, let's take one last run at at doing games, doing another game system, and Sam Trammell was a guy who really made links happen and kept links happening and all that, which still, as far as handheld platforms go, was absolutely awesome, right? But the even the Chiat ads for links with the kid in the bathroom and all that are really kind of frankly legendary.
Yeah.
But Jaguar was like the sort of last run, and we all kind of went in knowing that, well, this is going to be it, and we're going to have a blast, doing it, and let's go. So that's really where I made the pivot into the video game side. And what wound up ultimately happening is the guy that they had hired to sort of manage the third party side of things, he ultimately kind of crashed and burned at Atari, and we had a meeting up in the executive boardroom at the 1196 building, and I was sitting on Jack's right. Augie Ligori was sitting right across the table from me, and Jack was at the head of the table. And it was very bizarre because kind of, I think out of nowhere, Jack looked at me. He had said, so-and-so, has left the company. We all know that he didn't do that good of a job, blah, 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 whatever. And then he looks at me and he says, I haven't had a discussion with this with anybody really. But Mr. Rehbock, I think I would like you to, if you're interested, I would like you to take over the role of getting us some more games.
Wow.
And I was dumbfounded because I at the time I had Falcon 030 and getting direct to disc recording systems and stuff like that for Falcon, right?
Yeah.
But naturally, because of Falcon, we also, I was doing a lot of work on the gaming side with Falcon, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
And Augie looks at me and he says, I think what Jack really means to say is you're the guy. You really don't have any chance. Yeah. Or something like that, which was pretty funny, and everybody laughed. And that was the big pivot. It was really just Jack saying, "Hey, go do it."
Wow.
So yeah, so pretty wild time.
You had no inclination that was going to happen. It just on the spot.
Yeah, and the thing was that I had been helping out on Jaguar, but wasn't kind of in the thick of it. And less than a week later, I went up to LucasArts, where Kelly Flock was the president at the time, and I presented the Jaguar CD stuff.
Oh wow!
And what wound up happening was, and I don't know if you remember, but one of the 3 or 4 Jaguar CD demos that we had was the video clip of Star Wars.
Oh, okay.
And I said, hey, check this out. And they were really blown away, right? They because we were using the Cinepack codec and all that. And in terms of video streaming on that inexpensive of a device, it was pretty cool stuff. And one of the guys took me on the side after we were done having the chats, took me on the side and said, hey, by the way, you've got to check out this new game called Doom.
Oh, it's a great game. Yeah.
And it was Mark Hay Hutchinson who was the lead programmer for Zombies Ate My Neighbors, I think.
Yeah.
And Mark passed away a few years ago, but man, he did me a solid turning me on to Doom. And then I got back to the office and got in contact with Id down in Texas.
Yeah.
and wound up being put in contact with Jay Wilbur, who was there at the time. I stepped into it because I found out that Atari Chicago on Lynx had kind of screwed up a deal for Wolfenstein for Lynx with them.
Oh, really?
And as far as it was concerned, Atari owed them money.
Wow.
For a deal that had never gotten completely consummated. And it was just one of those awkward kinds of things that that kind of had happened in the latter days of Lynx, right? But I said, well, yeah, that's fine. Can I still come down and show you guys Jaguar, right? So I kind of talked myself, into that. Sat down, met John Carmack, met Adrian, met John Romero, the entire, id team.
Yeah.
And John was just smitten with Jaguar because it was kind of wacky, right? And it was right up his alley. The way that the blitter worked on Jaguar was almost perfect for running Doom because it really wasn't 3D. It was, this 2.5D engine.
Yeah.
And this notion of a span blitter was pretty cool for him. And, we kind of right there agreed on the general terms. And, and Doom was my first big deal for Jaguar.
I mean, what a game.
Yeah, exactly. It was a good one to land.
That was the first proper game you worked on for the Jaguar then, Doom. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And then I did a tour of Europe, mainly the UK, where I rented a Ford Mondeo, and drove from London up to the Midlands, out to Liverpool. And Snake Pass Road is still one of my favorite drives, from the Midlands across going west. And that's when I had signed up a bunch of the other titles out of the UK. Loic Duval, was working for me over in France, and he was the rock star that helped, put together those, the deals out of France.
Yeah.
I wound up meeting Julian Merceron, who I think is now still CTO at Namco.
Wow.
And I mean, what's really remarkable. Yeah. Anyway, it's remarkable. The number of people that you just dive in and go get stuff done. And the cool thing was that Jaguar, and then of course in the UK is when I got to meet Chris and Jason Kingsley,
yeah.
who by the way were already working on Alien versus Predator at that point, right? But
another classic, yeah.
Yeah, and the stuff that was being done for this, for this, this platform was actually kind of cool, know. So so that's that was my baptism, baptism by fire.
Oh, brilliant. We actually I spoke to James Purplehampton as well a few weeks ago, and he obviously was way really involved in Alien vs Predator, and he said very similar things about Sam Trammell as well. And did you ever work at all with James out of interest, or?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Yeah, he's obviously a real good guy as well. So now, I mean, between you two, I mean, you put together some of the best games on the system. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing was that the overall time at Atari, even my wife looks back on it with such fondness.
Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing was like when I very first started at Atari, one of the first interactions with Jack that I had was they had said, okay, you need to go to CeBIT, right? And I had just moved in February, and had my stuff, all of my belongings and the moving truck had not gotten to California yet, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still in corporate housing. I am driving I'm driving. Oh, what was the guy? The actor that was Fred Rated from the Federated department stores. But I'm driving this actor's Mercedes that Atari had taken back from him.
Yeah.
And I'm told, oh, you're going to go to CeBIT. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I kind of like, this is like a week or two before CeBIT in March or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I had known at the time in the airline industry, there were these things called bucket shops where you could get really good airfares. This is all totally pre-internet days and everything. Yep. So I had a guy back in Chicago that got me a good airfare on Pan Am Airlines, nonetheless. On like one of the last Pan Am rickety 747s probably that existed. And when the travel approval crossed Jack's desk, Jack called me up and said, who arranged this airfare for you? And I said, well, I did. And he said, well, what do you know about arranging airfare? And I said, well, I got a guy, and he said, I'm sure that this cannot be the best airfare. I said, Jack, it probably is, And so he has his secretary, Kathy, go and say, go get the best airfare, right?
Yeah.
So this whole interaction with Jack took about 15 minutes, but during the process of it, he said, tell you what, if you think this is the best airfare, and it turns out to be the best airfare, I will also buy a ticket for your wife and she can go too. If it's not the best airfare, you pay for it yourself since it's such a great deal. And I said, yeah, sure. Right. Well, little did I know that ultimately was kind of a test. Right.
Yeah.
And, to test my resolve. But really from that point on, I never, in the roughly 6 years that I was at Atari, I never had a bad interaction with Jack.
Yeah.
And both he and Sam and Leonard and Gary, from my perspective, were fantastic to work with and work for. My wife ultimately, by the way, did go to CeBIT. Because the airfare that I had was as good as I had promised him. And ultimately, my wife also wound up working at the what was the big show, the gaming show in London?
What's it called?
Where we launched Jaguar in Europe.
It's escaped me as well.
Was that crazy? But anyway, at that show, once again, Atari paid for my wife to go, and my wife worked the booth, in London, at what was it called? Earl's.
It's cool.
Earl's Court, yeah.
That was cool.
So, and actually, PlayStation debuted there also, right? Wow. PlayStation 1 debuted, and Kelly Flock was working at Sony at the time. But really, the dinners with Jack and Bob Gletto, who ran, Atari over in Europe, great times. So
that sounds like it. Well, that's some really good stories there. Thank you so much. Doom. I mean, we can talk about Doom forever, really, but yeah. It's often regarded as probably the best console conversion of the game, and it was converted onto a lot of consoles, as I'm sure you're aware. I mean, did you feel a lot of pressure working on that title? I mean, Doom is one of the biggest titles ever, isn't it?
Yeah, but the great thing was nobody knew about it yet.
Yeah.
All right. I had seen it when, before it had shipped on PC.
Yeah.
The original Doom was three 3.5 inch floppy disks for the PC that I think ultimately was published by GT Interactive.
Mm-hmm.
and nobody really knew about it. And you got to remember that there was no internet.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So news and pressure moved so much slower, you know. And the great thing about it was that John Carmack really, you know, I think ultimately it was a love-hate relationship with the hardware, but he loved the hardware, and he wrote his own compiler for the platform, and wrote his own compiler for Tom, the GPU and Jaguar that managed this whole code swapping thing, because the architecture of Jaguar was basically that your code for the code to run efficiently and as good as possible, your code had to run in the internal memory of the Tom chip, and you basically had to write your own cache manager to swap those chunks of code in and out, and for execution. And my recollection is that really the development Achilles heel of Jaguar was that the jump instruction on Tom, and frankly, I will give you this disclaimer that Leonard Trammell is the perfect guy to ask about this, but my recollection was that the jump instruction was broken. If you ran code in regular system memory and you jumped, either jumped from internal memory to external memory, when you returned to internal memory, you could land at an indeterminate memory location. Wow. And that was the bug. So the safe thing to do was you would use the blitter to blit blocks of code from system memory into Tom, and then it would execute super fast in the internal cache in Tom. But there was no cache tagging system or anything like that. You had to manage all that. But John Carmack wrote basically a compiler to do all of this for him so that he could focus on the game.
Wow.
And so Doom actually came along really fast. Was looking really, really good. And John Taylor, oh, I feel bad. But he was the guy that did the audio stuff.
Yeah.
And ultimately had the very multi-channel audio for all of the sound effects and things like that going in the game, which on PC largely relied on, Sound Blaster dedicated hardware, right?
Yeah.
So that was all running on Jerry. And, but the best part of the entire project was the one Monday morning when I came in, and I had gotten an email from John Carmack saying, "Hey, by the way, here's a little something. I had really kind of pretty much gotten Doom buttoned up on Friday, and I put a stack of CDs in my CD changer and kind of worked through the weekend. And I think he probably didn't sleep at all for all Saturday and all Sunday. Yeah. And he spit out Wolfenstein.
Oh wow!
And it was not part, like in no way, shape, or form was it part of the original agreement at all, right? He literally did it for fun, 100% on spec, right? Like, hey, I'm going to take this weekend and just do it. And then that Monday and Tuesday, Jay Wilbur and I figured out, how much extra, what we would pay for Wolfenstein. But the weird part about it is, given the fact that it was already done, it needed polish, of course, but doggone it, that they were one of the best developers that I'd ever worked with, and lo and behold, years later, still working with, when I was at Nvidia, working with Jay Wilbur at Epic and everything else, was pretty remarkable.
Wow. So. You've worked with some proper geniuses, it sounds like. John Carmack, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. How come the Doom version of the Jaguar version of Doom had no music in it, out of interest. Was that because there was no space left, or do you know why?
Yeah, well, so number one, the music would have taken more cartridge space.
Yeah.
Number two, the sample engine. This is a little bit fuzzy recollection, frankly.
Yeah.
Right? So I really should probably ask Mr. Taylor about how it all came to be, but. My recollection was, number one, we were cartridge space limited because there were a lot of textures in Doom.
Yeah.
And I believe the Jaguar version of Doom also wound up reusing some textures in some places that probably were missing a texture or two compared to the PC version.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that the right way to have done the music on Jaguar would have been using the General MIDI synth on Jaguar, but I believe that Jerry was so busy running the sample engine for all of the different samples that you could have in a scene, because you could have n number of different kinds of characters shooting at you. They had their own grunts and groans.
Yeah.
Each of the weapons they had their samples, and then you also had the samples of your weapons going on. So I'm pretty sure it was both a Jerry bandwidth and space consideration is kind of my recollection on that.
Brilliant. Just to help our listeners, obviously when you're saying Tom and Jerry, they're the two 32-bit. Is it processing? Is that right?
So Tom is the 64-bit.
Oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. Correct, thank you.
Yeah. Let's not.
Yeah.
Let's not get into that.
Let's do the math.
Yeah, but and the funny thing is, that being said, one of the biggest frustrations, frankly, from my perspective, and I think even a lot of developers' perspective, was what was the crazy press and everything over, is it really 64-bit? Right?
Yeah.
The funny thing is that, years later, you got Nvidia talking GeForce 256, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it was, and still to this day today, right, in the world of heavy duty graphics, it's all about the data bus, right?
Okay.
The instruction bus is not the important part, right? And it's really nice being able to have 64-bit or even 128-bit, programming instructions. But the real question always comes down in graphics to how fast can you move data around,
sure.
Right? And the 64 bits of Jaguar was the data bus, attested to the fact that both the development team at Eclipse as well as John Carmack were, in the first prototype Jaguar systems that they had, the guys at Eclipse used to run their system with a glass of ice sitting on top of Jaguar.
Really?
Because, yeah, when you would clear memory and all 64-bit data lines of Jaguar of the Tom chip would swing from 1 to 0 or 0 to 1, it could draw like 5 amps.
Wow.
Which was nutty. So the crazy thing was when 3DO and others were like, oh, it's not really 64-bit. We're like, it is so 64-bit,
wow.
It's painful.
Well,
so
I love it. I mean, that's great, and I love the Jaguar. I always defend the Jaguar, and that's brilliant to hear from a proper, someone who properly knows what they're talking about to really just lay it down there. So thank you so much.
Well, and the fact that games like Iron Soldier and games like like Doom and Wolfenstein legit were running on Tom.
Yeah.
And Leonard and everybody else used to say, hey, the 68K is there basically to boot the system and do housekeeping, right? And the funny thing is many years later, the reality of Nvidia's Tesla deep learning systems, right?
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing there is the Intel x86 is frankly there to boot the system and do housekeeping and I/O, right?
Yeah.
And for all of the companies like Google and Facebook and others that are using GPUs in the cloud to do remarkable stuff, the x86 is kind of meh, just like the 68K was in Jaguar.
Wow. I really it's so interesting hearing this insight. I mean, fair play to you. You've worked on some other Super Burnout, another classic. You've worked on some Jaguar CDs, is really good selection of games there as well. Do you have a personal favourite? Is there a game you made on the Jaguar particularly, or Jaguar CD that you think, this is the best I've produced?
Wow. Well, so a couple of months ago, when I got my hands on the, I can't remember the company in Germany, but their HDMI interface for Jaguar.
All right.
which the fact that this existed kind of blew me away, and that people were still spending engineering time on Jaguar years later.
Yeah.
I felt compelled. I had to buy it. That caused me to go into my storage and pull out Jaguar, of course, when I got it, because if I had it, I needed to see it working.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, the games that I pulled out were, of course, Doom.
You sure?
Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure.
Yeah.
Is another one that I loved. Valdecir Skiing, Super Burnout. And you know what else I really liked on Jaguar was Cannon Fodder.
Oh, it's a great game.
Right? I mean, those guys had perfect balance of strategy, sense of humor, everything else, and AVP.
Yeah, yep.
Man.
That's a great game. I mean, you just listen to great games there.
Yeah, so that pretty cool stuff. But yeah, and the other thing that was interesting with in the case of Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure, the number of interesting people that were involved in that game. So John Spinelli was the lead producer at Activision for it.
Yeah.
That game came to be as a result of a meeting that Sam Trammell and I had with Bobby Kotick in Hollywood. And it was great because I thought it was kind of a cool game, and they were doing it for Sega Genesis at the time.
Yep.
And but the other remarkable part about it was we had sent Scott Martin Gershon, who had around that time received the Oscar for the soundtrack for Born on 4th of July, I believe. Right. I think he won the Oscar. Worst case is he was nominated, right?
Still a big achievement.
Yeah, still a big achievement. But we sent a Jaguar, and James Grunke was the point guy interfacing with Scott, and we sent Scott the whole MIDI development system, right? And the MIDI sampling synth on Jaguar was one of Leonard Trammell's babies that he did a fantastic job with, and Scott just jumped into it with such ferocity, and the soundtrack for I listened today, and I've never frankly had a chance to verify this with Scott, but I'm pretty darn sure that ultimately the PC version of the PC version of
is it Pitfall?
Of Pitfall: Mayan Adventure actually had the soundtrack that Jaguar created.
Nice.
Okay, because I can hear almost no difference.
Yeah.
Right? And then naturally the Genesis version sounded really janky by comparison. But man, put that cartridge in a Jaguar and just listen to the soundtrack, and it's awesome, right? And so it was amazing that man, these big Hollywood guys got involved in those kind of games for Jaguar. And John was fantastic to work with. I continued to work with John at other companies afterwards. And gosh, the other title is Myst.
Of course, yeah.
Myst on Jaguar was for the longest time the only actual true color version of Myst, because it was better than the Mac version and better than any other platform, because we had gotten the original assets from Robin and Rand Miller at Cyan.
Yeah.
And Scott Sanders did the development. Yeah, so on Myst, Vince Zampella, who went on to be the CEO of Infinity Ward, and now is the CEO of Respawn, part of EA, was the lead tester for Myst.
Wow.
So the number of people, I mean, it is really incredible when you look at the number of people that were involved in Jaguar. And it's really kind of like the thing that makes me most proud of having been involved in Jaguar was, yes, it was cool hardware. It was one of the last, kind of weird hardwares that were very, hey, you had to dedicate, if you wanted to do a good game on the hardware, you had to dedicate to building the game on the hardware, which is so different than like where PlayStation and Xbox is today, because they're both just PCs. So kind of like, who cares? And it shows in the games that are being made for it, right? But doggone it, the people that contributed to the platform, like Chris and Jason Kingsley, like Kerry Ganofsky and the guys at High Voltage in Chicago, that have gone on to be just freaking amazing, right? Guys like Vince Zampella and Graham and everybody else, Purple, James Hampton, right? I mean, holy cow, the people that were involved every which way, Gerhard Langling and the guy that's now at a company called Sproing in the UK, the guys from Miracle Designs that still are in the game and doing amazing stuff for as contract developers for so many Nintendo games and things like that. It's pretty, the legacy of the people that basically cut their teeth on Jaguar, that are really kind of the hot stuff in the business today. By the way, and John Carmack and company, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Right. It's pretty insane. So, that's really kind of the best part.
Brilliant. I mean, I was talking to, like I said, James before, and he basically said, if you could get a game made on the Jaguar, any game, doesn't matter what it was, you deserve a pat on the back, because it wasn't easy to program on, and it was, like you're saying, but a really powerful machine. And I suppose learning and making games in the Jaguar would set you up for anything in the future. Is that a fair statement? Yeah,
I mean, to a large extent, because the bottom line is that Jaguar to a large extent was basically all about shaders, for one thing.
Yeah.
And my gosh, Jeff Minter was the master, in that stuff, right? And so at the end of the day, if you had done Jaguar stuff when time came to do DirectX 8 and modern OpenGL shaders and things like that, it gave you very good experience. so and the other cool part was it didn't have a lot of memory. It was a lot for the time. But also the other cool thing about Jaguar was the fact that it didn't have any frame buffer, and you kind of had this line buffer object processor thing going on, which was largely a forcing function to make sure that what you wrote was well optimized, right?
Nice, yeah.
But at the end of the day, guys like Scott Legrand, who worked at Atari, had done his Space War game for Jaguar, wound up being released after Atari, but Scott Legrand was one of the main guys at Nvidia that helped the original Halo get from 18 frames per second to being playable on the original Xbox, right? So cutting your teeth on Jaguar was ultimately good for, I think, everybody that crossed paths with it.
Brilliant. I mean, so many legends you just mentioned that have come out from working on the Jaguar. It's absolutely incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. But I need to ask you really quickly, Doom 2. I mean, the first Doom was excellent. Surely the Jaguar could take Doom 2. I think some homebrew developers have actually made Doom 2, but did you ever personally start work on Doom 2, or did you ever see it being built before you left?
Yeah, no, I don't think we did, because my recollection was that I didn't think that Doom 2, even at id, had really been much more of a twinkle in anybody's eye.
Sure.
At the time. I remember seeing the artwork and the real world models for it. But no, I don't. I mean, we certainly never got to contract or anything like that. And if it had been at all because of John's ability to make stuff for Jaguar, just divine it out of thin air, we would have it would have been a deal that would have gotten signed really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So I don't think so.
Okay, fair enough. Your list of games you worked on is very impressive, but I hope you won't be offended now. But there is one game which I don't particularly like. White Men Can't Jump. I actually own the game. I've tried to play it. I've tried to enjoy it. I just can't get into it. What do you think about that particular game? Are you proud of the game? Do you think it gets a bit of an unfair stick by fans? What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, the thing was so by the way, that was a deal that I did with Kelly Flock,
okay,
who had moved from LucasArts, and he was now at Trimark Interactive, and his head of biz dev, Gary, was a great guy.
Yeah.
The movie was supposed to be, was going to be fantastic.
I quite like the film. It's all right.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and actually the guys at High Voltage did the development on it, right?
Yeah.
And we were just kind of trying to do some crazy stuff that, we basically, not even so much budget, but we just didn't have really enough time. There was not enough runway in the schedule to refine it.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of it was to do kind of a traditional 2-on-2, street basketball game, right? Kind of in the vein of, Larry Bird and those kind, right?
Yeah.
So I don't fault any of us for trying to do it, but like I said, it's just a game that really kind of suffered from not enough runway. So yeah, and frankly, it's kind of, the two that always leave me scratching my head a little bit are White Men Can't Jump and of course Fight for Life.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And Fight for Life, Francois Ybertrand, who is the lead on that, had come off of doing,
Virtual Fighter. Is that right?
Virtual Fighter.
Yeah.
But that was another one that, man, we just did not, we really, and I certainly am happy to take a lot of the hit for it. We certainly did not budget enough for it, right?
Well, wasn't that the last game made by Atari for the Jaguar? Was that officially the last ever?
Maybe. I mean, Atari still kind of. I wasn't there for the lights getting turned out.
Oh, okay.
But like guys like Don Thomas and I think even John Scrutch, certainly were there after I had gone over to Sony already, and I mean, the interesting thing about that was we were really trying to play with the big boys.
Yeah.
Virtua Fighter was not fully textured, and we were trying to do a fully textured game on a system that you basically had to do your own geometry for your 3D and everything else. And I mean, there are a couple things about it that are kind of cute, but yeah, I mean, other companies would have probably cut the game off sooner.
Yeah.
The fact that Sam, especially with Fight for Life, that Sam was like, yeah, okay, when we focus grouped it, it was kind of it definitely was not one that would Metacritic it, 80+%, right? But there were people that thought it was pretty cool, and we wanted to, we badly needed a game of that kind of genre. Sure. Right?
Yeah.
So it was the thing that we had made the bet on, and Sam greenlit to let it ship. But yeah, I mean, in retrospect on White Men Can't Jump, bless the hearts of the guys at High Voltage, because they would have been able to deliver a better product given more time, and they would have been willing to do it. And frankly, in the case of Fight for Life, the game needed about 3 more artists, and both art and animation. But the core engine for Fight for Life was actually pretty solid.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I actually quite like the game. I think it's got a bit of depth to it, like learning new moves and so forth. I actually quite enjoy Fight for Life, personally. Yeah. But I can see what you're saying. It could have done with a bit more ironing out here and there.
Right.
I love asking this question. I've spoken to quite a few Jag legends, and I'm really interested to hear what you've got to say about this. Did you ever start work on any other Jag games that were never released? I mean, I hear so many stories about games that were pretty much finished but never came to fruition. Have you got any unreleased games that you don't mind sharing a bit of ideas to our listeners?
Yeah, well, I mean, like things like was it Varuna's Forces?
Okay.
Was one of the ones. And then, I mean, I've seen in the message boards, a lot of them, kind of talked about, I mean, the one that Jeremy Stiglitz and those guys were working on. It's so funny because you kind of make it a point not to get married to the working title names.
Yeah.
So it's like I remember the development teams better than I do the games themselves,
Sure.
The one that I would have liked to have seen gotten readdressed was Rob Zadibel had done such a great job on the Atari ST version of Star Raiders.
Yep.
I would have liked to have seen a really good, proper, iteration of Star Wars done. And I think Miracle Designs also had another game design after Atari Karts and stuff that, and Atari Karts, by the way, is yet another game that was actually pretty cool.
I like the game. I agree. I think it's very well done.
And doing mode 7, mode 7 emulation, in software was pretty awesome. Mode 7 with hills, by the way.
Yeah. I like it. I've played it quite recently, and I think it definitely holds up against Mario Kart. And you could argue you could argue it's better in a lot of senses. The original Mario Kart, I love it. I think, brilliant game.
Well, and and Peter Vermeulen and Philip Hauke from Miracle, continue to do a lot of Nintendo stuff, which is pretty wild. So but yeah, so and the thing again, the thing that you have to remember is that I had left and had gone to Sony.
Yeah.
And I was already kind of well engaged there, so guys like John Scrutch and maybe Don Thomas would be a little more familiar with, was there anything still happening in the last vestiges, right?
Oh, fair enough. Obviously, you've worked at Atari for a long time, and I'm sure you agree it's quite sad how it all sort of ended there. I know they're still around in a sense even today, but how would you reflect back on Atari? I mean, how would you reflect your time there? Was it the best time of your life, would you say, or?
Yeah, I kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, and my first son was born while I was at Atari, right? He kind of learned to walk, wandering around halls at Atari, while I was there, at the end of the day. Sam and Jack, certainly, outside of business, but even within business, there was so much heart, with them and everybody else at Atari. You look at the pictures of the fake Batmobile, that are up on Facebook, right? I think everybody has seen those. And you see, the Atari employees that are kind of standing out in front of the building, gathered around checking out stuff like that while we were working on, Batman Returns or whatever it was for Lynx.
Yeah.
Those are not posed, oh, look what a great team photos we are. Those are, everybody that was involved, was in there because they loved it,
Yeah.
And the thing is that a lot of the sort of Atari, employee mentality legacy carried over from even the original Nolan Bushnell Atari, right?
Sure, yeah.
And for as crazy as that is, for as crazy as that had gotten, and out of control, when Jack came in and bought the company and they were losing crazy money literally per day.
Yeah.
And Sam and Jack and Leonard had to do, the layoffs that they did and everything else. But, the funny thing was that even, years after, my hiring guys like Jerry Jessup, totally amazing old school Atari guy at Sony who was, and continues to be a rock star. The legacy of people that worked at Atari, I don't talk to many people that are, that really say that it was horrible.
Yeah.
So, I did have a great time.
Brilliant. I mean, everyone I've spoken to has nothing but good things to say about the place. I think James said it was like chaos, but sort of so fun as well. It was like organised chaos almost, like everyone helping each other, and it was just a good atmosphere.
Well, yeah, certainly, and not anywhere near like the crazy chaos in our White House right now.
Yeah, that's a fair point. What was your exact role working for Sony? Were you involved in the first PlayStation? Is that right?
Well, I started at Sony about almost a year to the day after Sony had shipped in Japan. So it was I started at Sony around the point in time that PlayStation 1 began shipping in the U.S. And I had been recruited for quite some time by Bernie Stoller to leave Atari and go over to Sony. Bernie had already successfully recruited guys like Joe Sousa and Scott Hunter and others. And, as things were starting to wind down at Atari, it was kind of the right time.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I understand.
but yeah, and ultimately I got hired as director of R&D and developer support, and then very quickly, and kind of the plan from even the time that I was hired, very quickly after that, Takashi Asuki, who ultimately was the person that hired me. So while Bernie had wanted me to come in working for him, ultimately they had me reporting to Takashi, who was really kind of on the hardware engineering side, one of Ken Kutaragi's main, right-hand guys.
Yeah.
Takashi had wanted to get back to Japan to get back with his family.
Fair enough.
And and Takashi was a great mentor for me at Sony, that made me understand how Sony really worked and everything. And then Takashi moved back, and then I got promoted roughly 3 months after I started there to VP of R&D and developer support.
Brilliant. Excellent. You also worked at VM Labs, is that correct, as the vice president?
Yes.
And you helped work on a very unusual, probably even more mysterious than the Jaguar in a sense, the Nuon console.
Yeah.
Now, there might be a few listeners that don't even know what the Nuon is. Do you mind, how did this opportunity come about? And do you mind giving a little really quick background on the Nuon console, what it was all about?
Yeah, so Richard Miller, who was the VP of R&D at Atari, responsible for Jaguar, responsible for one of the projects that Richard had been working on was a C-Cube decoder cartridge that would allow you to play MPEG video, instead of just like the Cinepack software codec stuff that we were doing. And at the latter parts of Jaguar, this whole notion of MPEG was kind of the big buzzword.
Yeah.
And ultimately that would become the basis for DVD.
Yeah.
Right. And Richard had spooled up VM Labs to do this Merlin media processor, which was a media processor that would replace fixed function decoders like C-Cube's MPEG decoder and Zoran's MPEG decoder within DVD players, which barely existed.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So at that point in time, what was interesting was there was like this war going on between Toshiba and Warner Brothers. So Toshiba and Warner Brothers were the DVD guys, and Sony, Sony and Sony Pictures, et cetera, were in the other camp that wanted to do disc media their way.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And Sony Philips basically kind of owned the standard for compact disc, and Toshiba wanted to assert themselves. And Toshiba had owned a pretty good percentage of Warner Brothers at the time and all that. So the good thing about what Richard wanted to do is this thing that he was going to build was going to be able to service either of them, right?
That's clever.
Right. And then the other big idea was by doing a media processor that was programmable, fully programmable for whatever kind of codec. So any kind of emerging codec, it should have been able to handle, right?
Yeah.
But most importantly, and the reason that I got involved was, hey, and by the way, when you're not playing TVs, you can use this horsepower to play video games.
It sounds ahead of its time, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So freakish. I mean, in so many ways, so freakishly ahead of its time, it didn't know what to do with itself.
Yeah.
So, but, the great thing about it was that, there were a lot of existing Atari developers that were interested in doing stuff for the platform. I ultimately wound up doing a demo for Bing Gordon and others at Electronic Arts, and Nancy Smith and Linda Chaplin, who was the VP of BizDev at the time.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit late, because the funding wound up running out, and that was largely because of the market collapse that had happened, right?
Yeah.
And it was just like nobody was going to get funding, and the timing wound up being all wrong. But the bottom line was that there was enough interest in the platform that I didn't have ink on paper, but I had like signed off paper for Tiger Woods Golf.
Wow.
And Madden Football at what anybody would say were just unbelievably sweetheart deals.
Yeah,
right?
huge names, yeah.
Right, and Spider-Man from Activision. So Spider-Man was like the big hot thing coming up on PlayStation and stuff like that at the time. Lots of really interesting interest. And the funny thing was that like Samsung and Toshiba, even after VM Labs had gotten sold off to Genesis Microchip, their DVD players kind of wound up hanging around on the market for a little while. Yeah. And it cracked me up because VM Labs was like done and put on the shelf. And there were a couple, for almost a year afterward, there were still Nuon games showing up on store shelves at Best Buy.
Wow.
Which was pretty incredible.
That is, it is a fascinating piece of history, isn't it? I mean, do you actually own a Nuon yourself still? Have you got one at home?
I mean, not running, but yeah, I actually have. So I have an unreleased Samsung prototype still.
Nice.
I think that Keita Aida, who still is in Nvidia, I think he gave that to me.
Oh, cool.
But pretty interesting stuff. And certainly from a personal career standpoint, having been able to work so closely with companies like Toshiba, I was the guy that did the deal for Tetris that got bundled with Toshiba's DVD player.
Oh, cool.
And again, kind of extending the legacy of Tetris to being the game that's probably been on every single piece of hardware except for a microwave oven. Right?
That maybe next year. That could be the next plan for next year, possibly.
Yeah, exactly.
Really quickly, Tempest 3000, Iron Soldier 3, Space Invaders XL. You had your hands involved in 3 of those. Probably arguably the 3 best, or certainly up there, best games for the Nuon. Do you have a personal favourite out of those 3 titles?
Oh, wow. I think still probably Iron Soldier.
Yeah.
The thing that was remarkable about Iron Soldier is the fact that it was doing like 32-bit Z buffering before kind of almost anybody else, right? I mean, there were so many interesting things about that game. And it played well, so, those, and then, my gosh, Tempest, but the one thing that we haven't talked about is like Jeff Minter's Visual Light Machine stuff.
Oh, of course, with the Jag CD, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was so funny. This morning, my playlist randomly played the song Children by not Michael Oldfield, but the other guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But that was the first song that I saw VLM demoed with, right? From Jeff.
Yeah.
And it's just like, holy cow, still to this day, some of the best music to video kind of stuff with great beat detection and all that. So, and the other thing about Nuon that's remarkable, and, looking at things like NVIDIA Shield and Roku and all of the other kinds of digital sort of streaming things that are out there, or any Blu-ray player, the fact that Nuon could rewind in real time or up to 2x smooth backward decoding of MPEG streams was, to this day, is shocking. And and the zoom, what movie was it? The one with Elizabeth Hurley and Brendan Fraser.
Oh, it was
Bedazzled.
Was it Bedazzled?
Yeah. Right. I mean, so like that actually had Nuon features built into the movie.
Really?
Which was pretty cool, But again, man, all of that was going on before all of the interactive Blu-ray stuff, right? I mean, it really kind of set the stage for that. And what was remarkable is a lot of the people, frankly, that were involved in Nuon, John Matheson still is working at Nvidia on the automotive side. Man, the rock stars that came out of Atari, continued at Nuon, and still are doing crazy, amazing stuff today. I'm proud to know these people. So that's the cool part.
Nice one. Really quickly then, before we wrap things up, got a few last minute questions. Nvidia, that was your next step, is that right, Bill? What was that like?
Yeah. So I did a 15-year tour of duty.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, were you out the games industry then? Were you moving away from games a bit then, or were your hands still involved in games at all?
So at Nvidia, I was still in the thick of the game side of things, and basically the big thing that I did at Nvidia was I took the respect for the notion of how critical developers are to doing what you do.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I in one of the talks that I gave at Sony, I had said, thank you so much for making sure that we're not just building doorstops, right?
Yeah.
Because hardware without games and the hardware without developers is a perfect doorstop. And when I started at Nvidia, Nvidia and ATI and Intel and everybody else and their brother basically treated games like clip art. Right.
Sure.
It was, the latest cool game was the thing that you stuck you stuck a simulated image on a screen in a Sunday circular. Right.
Yeah.
And what Nvidia was kind of trying to figure out how to do was be more relevant and be more relevant at the heart of developers. And that's where, and again, inspired by John Carmack, back in the day before there were blogs and stuff like that, John Carmack used to do his .plan files, and he would release kind of his musings on a regular basis and talk about the latest games that he was working on and his position, perspective on the industry and everything else. And in my recollection is like late 2000 kind of time frame, John had done a .plan file where he had said, whenever I'm developing new stuff, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but when I'm developing new stuff, if my code is not working right on NVIDIA hardware, I assume that I've got a bug. When it's screwed up on anybody else's hardware, and he didn't use names because he was always careful. Whenever I have problems on anybody else's hardware, I assume it's either their graphics drivers or their hardware, the hardware itself.
Yeah.
It's like semicolon, I use NVIDIA as my gold standard.
Wow, that's big praise, isn't it?
Yeah, and my perspective on it was that, and I've always been a car buff and racing fan and stuff like that. And the bottom line is using kind of today as a comparison, the Volkswagen Beetle with a 400 plus horsepower engine in it that is used for rallycross is not a car that you buy at the dealer, right? The NASCAR cars that you see, racing, making perpetual left turns are not cars. Those kind of stock cars are not cars that you buy.
Sure.
But the thing that struck me when I set foot in the door at NVIDIA was, my gosh, the cards that we send to developers really are off the shelf.
Yeah.
Right? They are the thing. And the funny thing was you got to remember my background at the time was also VM Labs and Nuon, and knowing how expensive the tools were that studios used to author DVDs and things like that, right? And So my perspective was really, if you want to, and I knew that largely most developers were developing using Nvidia hardware. GeForce at the time, GeForce 3 and early samples of GeForce 4, which would be the exact hardware that we eventually shipped to consumers. And Jim Black, who now I think is at Magic Leap, he was one of the guys that as we were kind of brainstorming what to call the program and things like that, he didn't come up with quite the exact phrase, but it was Jim, whatever Jim had blurted out at the time was the final inspiration for the way it's meant to be played, which everyone at Atari thought was too long of a phrase. Not at Atari. Everyone at Nvidia. And there's people at Nvidia that are still there to this day that are like, wow, the way it's meant to be played was way too long of a tagline, blah, 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 blah. But my perspective as a marketer is you say what you want to say, and you say what you mean, and you mean what you say. And the bottom line was that if you put an NVIDIA graphics card in your PC, pixel for pixel with the drivers and everything else, you would be on the exact same hardware that the guys that designed the game would be, had developed the game on.
Well, it makes you wonder why you go elsewhere, I suppose. Yeah, fair play.
Yeah, so exactly. So the bottom line was that what we wanted was, I wanted to put together a program that paid homage to the developers, and at the end of the day, for them basically on their boxes and in their games, and if you do like a YouTube search for the way it's meant to be played boot up, right, you'll see a lot of the really cool things that developers wound up doing with the way it's meant to be played logo at the beginning of their games, kind of very similar to like what Pixar does with Luxo and those kinds of things.
Yep.
And in my mind, and naturally the inner workings, people at Nvidia didn't quite understand, because it really was all about developers saying, on the margin, and here's the other important thing, and the message that I would send to anybody doing platforms and anybody trying to do anybody trying to do anything with developers, what you want to be able to say is, what would you recommend to your brother-in-law or to your nephew to play your game on?
Sure.
Right. And that was the kind of impetus for my 15-year run at Nvidia.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a great, it's a great advice there, and great. Well, I really appreciate that, Bill. Some good stuff.
If you're making hardware that, is, if you're developing on hardware and you're a manufacturer of a platform, you basically want to make sure that you're building something that the people that are making the games for it are going to say, this is the best way to see my game.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes more common sense, doesn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah.
You now work at Cast AR, is that correct?
Well, I'm working with the folks at Cast AR. Can't really talk too much about any of the stuff that's going on there, because they kind of ran out of their funding a while ago. Right now I'm even just as a consultant kind of sitting back waiting to see, what's going to happen with that. One of the other companies that I'm working with is GameFace Labs, though, who are working with Nvidia doing a standalone VR headset that's pretty fun and interesting, and certainly in the context of doing lightweight, easy to get into VR.
Nice.
They're doing really, really cool stuff. So I've got a couple different of those projects going on, and then continuing to work with developers, getting them connected to companies like Nvidia and things like that, because I still think that Android TV is a big thing. you know, the video game industry, what's funny is the video game industry beginning, you know, with interchangeable content like a la 2600 is oddly older than the home video market, right?
That's amazing.
It's older than right, because it happened before VHS tapes.
Yeah,
right?
wow, yeah. You don't really think like that, do you? But you're right. Wow.
No, and I think about that painfully almost every day. And what's crazy about it is that we are so many years into it, and the video game industry is still, you know, interactive entertainment is still kind of this weird thing that the most that can be said for it is this weird political thing going on with violence in video games and the White House and stuff like that, which totally makes no sense whatsoever, right?
I agree, yeah.
But the bottom line is that the world needs a legitimate sort of standardized platform still. So that, you know, unlike in the mobile space, you know, Samsung changes model numbers and things like that every which way. It's so difficult for game developers to release a game for Android even, right? And frankly, it's difficult to release a game for iOS, where Apple owns the platform hook, line, and sinker, but across different iPhones, it's difficult to get compatibility working and things like that because the platform holders break the platform constantly and all that. So one of my big tasks still to this day is the quest for a solid standardized platform for game developers to be able to concentrate on making games for, rather than fighting the hardware all the time.
That sounds almost too good to be true. But I agree
it is. But I'm the eternal optimist.
Quick, two last questions then, and this question's gonna be tough, I'm sure. But obviously, you've been involved in making games and creating world-class games throughout your career. But is there what are your personal favourite video games of all time? Have you got like a top three that you just? That's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, how about, okay, so the first game that will still come to mind winds up being Star Raiders, but also, by the way, Wing Commander.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So Wing Commander is in a lot of respects the kind of spiritual successor to Star Raiders, right? Whether or not Chris, you know, ever thought of it that way, I don't know, right? But I gotta tell you, kind of in the same vein, my go-to game right now has been Star Trek Bridge Crew.
Oh, okay.
You know, it's I think one of the most delightful VR experiences that exists. And man, if it wasn't for the pain of having to suit up with, you know, VR thing on your head and all that, you know, so yeah. But I wind up playing so many games on and off. From a genre standpoint, I'm big on puzzle games and like Sokoban kind of style games, which is why Chip's Challenge and Chuck's Challenge continue to be, you know, kind of go-to games for me.
Yeah.
But then give me a game with a fantastic storyline and character arc, like, you know, kind of, I wouldn't say all the Tomb Raiders, but man, Tomb Raider, you know, Tomb Raider 2013 and Rise of the Tomb Raider, the original Tomb Raider 1, which I was heavily involved with the performance analyzer at Sony. You know, I mean, I love Lara Croft. I did shots with Rona Mitra at the PlayStation party.
Nice.
Oh, by the way, the European trade show for games that we were trying to pick up, ECTS.
There you go. We got it now.
But yeah. So I did, you know, with Rona Mitra, who is the original Tomb Raider.
Yeah, Lara Croft. Yeah.
You know, so yeah, those, you know, Tomb Raider and my gosh, Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Oh, that game is amazing.
It's as close to a perfect game as you could get.
I put so many hours into it. I love it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've got like 180 something hours into it. Every time I hear that they've released some new DLC stuff, I go back to it. But the thing about Zelda is that it is a perfect game both for consumers And you can see while you're playing the game that from a development standpoint, the architecture of that game is just built so beautifully to be able to release a game and release a game on time. So I'm in awe of that game and the development team.
I have to agree. Yeah.
And then the other shout outs that I have to give is practically any game built by that game company. So Journey, I've got the original concept art of Journey of Flower that hangs above my fireplace.
Cool.
And I've got original concept art that I won in an auction that's hanging above my piano from Journey. And those games also, anybody that played Journey on PlayStation, and the moment they realize, holy crap, that's actually another person, right?
I'm gonna have to try it out. I haven't actually played Journey. I will play it.
Oh, sorry about that spoiler.
It's all right.
But that's kind of where my head's at when if you hold a gun to my head and tell me I gotta tell you what I like.
Bill, it's been a real pleasure. I mean, I really do appreciate you going to such depth, and some of the stories you've told are fascinating, mind blowing, and your career has just been so many highlights. It's absolutely incredible. We ask all our guests, whether it's a text interview or a podcast interview. You kind of answered already, actually, because you said you had a drink already with Lara Croft. But if you could go with a drink with any other video game character, who would you choose and why?
Oh wow! Well, I mean, in the vein of Lara Croft, Drake, right? Let me be Michael in the in the PlayStation commercial, right? I want to hang out in that bar, right?
Yeah.
So, or Mark Hamill from Wing Commander.
It's a great choice. That's a great choice, actually. Oh, Bill, look, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for sharing so many great stories. Thank you, Bill.
All right. Very good. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch regarding this week's episode or anything else, you can tweet us at Arcade Attack UK, at Keith Barlow 82, and at arcade_Adriano. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/Arcade Attack UK. Please check out our website at arcadeattack.co.uk for lots of retro gaming goodness, interviews, reviews, features, top 10s, etc. And you can also find all our previous podcasts there. Our podcasts are available to stream from the website and are available to download for free from Stitcher, Podbean and iTunes, where you can also leave us a review and a rating, which we would really, really appreciate. So until next time, take care and we'll speak to you soon.